joined by Joe Norman. Joe is the founder and chief scientist at Applied Complexity Science, LLC, and the author of the occasional Applied Complexity newsletter, promised monthly, delivered occasionally. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate the invite and appreciate your flexibility in scheduling. I know I was a bit of a pain in the ass and bounced us around a bit, but I'm glad we're finally able to sit down and talk.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you on. I mean, no worries about the scheduling. I'm at a painful hour for anyone in that part of the world, so you're not the first person to postpone this a little bit because it's kind of in the middle of people's day. But I'm a kind of an avid follower of your Twitter and also of your wife Chelsea's Twitter. It's quite different, but very wholesome and very full of signal. And I'm excited to talk to you about complexity, about the thing that you are known for and the thing that you know more about than most people. So my first question is about something in this space that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. It's about how society, at what level of abstraction society models humans. And I know this sounds really weird, but I'm referring kind of to this vision that we have about the individual. We model society at the level of the individual, but there's not really any conception, I feel, in kind of what we call now neoliberalism for a different scale. Like, for example, maybe modeling society as kind of like a superorganism.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious what your feeling is about this. Like, is there any benefit to thinking about ourselves in a different way, or is that even possible, or are we kind of stuck with this frame of being individuals, interacting with individuals, and does this frame kind of magically result in the best results?
A great question, and there's a lot of different questions embedded in there. One thing, and this actually came up in a Twitter conversation just the other day, and it gave me an insight that was sort of there, but was kind of latent and brought to the surface. One thing is that if we kind of only consider this level of the individual as sort of primary and unquestionable, and there's nothing that is or should be larger scale than that, then sort of ironically, we end up with a situation where the only kinds of collective behaviors that do emerge are these kind of mass coherent behaviors where everybody's doing the same thing, sort of mass conformity. So one of the things that I'm seeing more and more is that we're really not like when we think about, to be frank, I'm not great with these terms, neoliberalism and things like that. I never know exactly what they mean. So I try to avoid them, but the general idea of kind of the individual is the essence of things. It's always the appropriate level of analysis, and that's how it is, and that's how it ought to be. I think what that's delivered to us is, for some folks, that's sort of the case of their life. They behave as an individual. They kind of do things without coordinating tightly with others, et cetera, et cetera. But then we have things like what we see on the other side, which is kind of this wokeism, if you will, where you have a mass coherence. It's very much collectivist, but it's collectivist in a very non-nuanced way. It's everybody doing the same thing, everybody having the same opinions, everybody kind of collapsing onto one way of life, one way of viewing the world, and one way of acting. So it's not that through this kind of arc of neoliberalism, it's not that we've come to this place where we're all simply atomized individuals and that's how we're actually behaving. It's kind of gone around the other side, where without what you might think of as intermediate structures, things like local community, and then sort of gradations beyond there. So you have individual, say family, local community, village, town, city, region, nation, maybe globe eventually. All of these levels have their own in the most organic unfolding of things. They would all have their own kind of tangible existence to them. They're all legitimate. There's no primary level of analysis, and this is something that flows very naturally from complexity science. The fact that there's multiple scales of structure, and there's not one that explains everything, or that everything can be reduced to. So now we're ending up with this kind of very bipolar, not bipolar in the sense of say left versus right or progressive versus conservative, but bipolar in the sense of atomized individuals or mass coherent collective behavior without the nuanced levels in between those. And I think that's what we're ultimately missing, that we've historically had just incidentally by the course of ecosystems and nature. Those things arise naturally. But in the hollowing out of these, we haven't just ended up with atomized individuality. We've also ended up with kind of mass mob behavior, if you will. So I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, but that's something that's kind of coming to the surface for me in a really explicit way.
Yeah, that makes sense in the sense that, you know, through this process of atomization that you describe, kind of the only thing left is this, you know, this massive coherence phenomena that in a way is advocating for the individual. Because I mean, what is wokeness except for like the militant arm of individualism, you know, kind of advocating for people to be more individual in the sense of kind of like freeing themselves from the body, you know, becoming this self-making self where you can, you know, kind of customize your existence through different identities, you know, that are chosen. They're all kind of rationally, freely chosen by you. So it's in a way it's kind of a liberatory movement, but in a strange way it's also kind of almost the most collectivist thing that we can produce. Like it's quite coherent, quite quite centralized in that way.
Right. And you know, one of the things, so I have this issue where when I'm kind of addressing the ideas from the left, I often find that there's a kernel of truth in them, but that the way they're kind of operationalized is not right. And so for instance, like you brought up, this sort of what you've called self-making self. Well, that's interesting, because what does make the self? Well, in a very material sense, selves are self-producing and self-maintaining. That's kind of what biology is in a way. It's like, where am I being made from? Well, I'm not like a car. There's no car maker who manufacturer comes and puts my parts together. I actually am generating myself. You're generating yourself. Societies are the same way. They self-generate when they're functional. I think we're in a place now where they're kind of not doing that. We're kind of on a transient trajectory to who knows where. But there's and just sort of taking that maybe to another layer of abstraction, kind of what you're suggesting is there's this arbitrariness in this kind of mental model of how things are, that because I'm self-generating, I can self-generate to be whatever I want to be, whatever I choose to be. So I think there's this you know, in kind of postmodern rhetoric, there's a lot of discussion around what's constructed, socially constructed, and so on. And I think that that's true, that we construct many things about the world. We are building the world in many ways, in our world. But the conflation that I detect that happens here is that because something is constructed, it's arbitrary. And those two things do not actually go together. Those are not the same, and they become conflated. I mean, just as a really simplified example, imagine that, okay, so we've discovered pyramids all over the world, right? Now say we go and discover a pyramid that's standing on its tip. Okay, you're not going to discover that pyramid. It's not stable. It's going to tip over, right? So just the fact that we have constructed pyramids doesn't mean you can construct anything, any shape, any structure, any geometry. There's constraints that the world kind of gives us, however they come. And what's constructed then has to in some way fit into those constraints and respect them if it's to persist. Obviously, you can try to build a pyramid on its tip and the breeze comes and blows it over. But yeah, so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, no, we actually are constructing a lot of what the world is, but that doesn't mean we can construct anything whatsoever and expect it to work.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's kind of an area that people misconstrue the emergence of a lot of what is socially constructed. Like, for example, a lot of the chat is about, you know, the categories of female and male and, you know, all these gender roles that are socially constructed. They are socially constructed, they are socially reinforced, but they are emergent from the biological substrate, like in most cases, and in ways
they have relations to it, to be sure. And you know, that doesn't mean that we can sit here and say what are all the possibilities of functional conceptualizations around things like male and female. There might be reasonable constructions that are different than the ones we're used to operating in, that are legitimate themselves. When we get to these kinds of discussions, where I see the issue is not so much that people shouldn't explore and tinker and see what might work, but that the tendency to try to bring others into conformity with that vision. It's the coercive aspect that I find problematic. If you know, there are, and I'm no expert in this, but I know there are some ancient traditions. I know where there are some kind of gender bending type of roles that are played in social systems, and they persisted and they had a function, presumably. And so I can't, my imagination, and no one's, is big enough to imagine all of the possibilities of how these things could fit together. You know, the way an elephant works is very different than the way a butterfly works. They both exist. So yeah, my issue is sort of the reduction to an imagined system or structure, and then trying to impose that on a large swath of people. I think that's where it becomes, for me, you know, to borrow the word, problematic.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I feel like for an identity to be real for a lot of people, you know, the realness of it comes from it being accepted, and you know, that category being accepted by other people. So I feel like that's kind of the, you know, in a way it kind of has to be coercive, um, for it to actually take shape. I know obviously I'm not for it. I understand why people kind of want to make these kind of rights revolutions where they, you know, they invent, I don't know, invent a category, or there's a category emerging, and then they want it to be widely used. And yeah,
Yeah,
there's
widely acknowledged. And I mean, I think the operative term there is actually widely. It's like, because widely used to mean, like, I don't know, my friends and family, and now widely means everyone on Twitter. And it's like, that's you can't get everyone to do the same thing across the entire globe, and it would be disastrous if you did. So yeah, no, I totally agree. And so back to kind of your original question. Yes, we are individuals in many important ways. We are part of very real collective structures, and indeed things like identity. People are seeking acknowledgement, and not, it's really, that's kind of shows you it's not really about merely the isolated individual, but how it fits into to a larger system. um, and it's the largeness of our systems now that are the main problem, not necessarily any particular character that exists within them.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point, and you talk about this all the time, about the issue of scale. And I wonder, what is your feeling? Are you a techno optimist given the situation that we're in now? Because you know, everything's at scale. You know, the complexity is absolutely unmappable. What's your feeling about the future of technology and the way it functions now, and kind of the trajectory that you see?
Well, I don't think I'm a techno optimist. You'd have to tell me exactly what you mean by that. I don't think I am. Probably pretty definitively not one. If anything, I probably lean more towards being a Luddite. You know, where we're at now is that all of our technology now, it used to be that technology was about solving a problem you have locally, about doing something with more local efficiency, kind of fitting into whatever the constraints are, and cutting out some of the grunt work of it. But it, you know, through the 20th and into the 21st century now, the main trajectory of technology has been connectivity, physical connectivity, informational connectivity. And what we're seeing now is that connectivity is not an unmitigated good. There's a lot of risks that come along with it. There's a lot of costs associated with it. If you talk to economists, you'll hear a lot about economies of scale. Well, we're now starting to experience the diseconomies of scale. It's not for free. So I'm not an optimist in the sense that I don't know where we're going. I'm also not a pessimist because I don't know where we're going. But what's clear to me is what we need to learn to do is to self-limit our own degree of connectivity, so that we don't end up with a disaster. And so far, I haven't seen any evidence that we're able to do that very well. But if we don't learn to do that, it's going to be increasingly a problem. I mean, regardless of whatever one's views are on the COVID situation, the policies, whatever, what's clear is that why did it happen the way it happened? It's because of how connected we are. it's and associated with that, it's because of our refusal to disconnect at any time, and also the way we've set up the infrastructure so that it interrupts a lot of essential processes to disconnect. You know, if the food is flowing from Alaska to China to the East Coast of the U.S., something like that, which it sounds ridiculous but happens all the time, things like that. Then all of a sudden, if you need to interrupt those flows, you have a lot of new problems to solve. So we need to become willing to disconnect, and we need to take away the stigma of disconnecting as such. It's been stigmatized, you know, it's xenophobic, it's this and that. In the beginning of COVID, we saw this. I mean, there was a huge, it's easy, everyone seems to forget now, there was a huge political flip-flop on COVID. Like the whole social system. There was originally, you know, there was people like me who were saying, this thing doesn't look good in China. Understanding how multiplicative agents behave, i.e. they grow exponentially and they spread rapidly, especially in connected world. It was obvious we need to disconnect right now. So, you know, maybe it will turn out it's not that big a deal. Now we reconnect. Okay. Maybe it turns out it's a bigger deal and we are glad we disconnected. Well, it was xenophobic, it was racist, etc. in January, February 2020 to not want to mill about in Chinatown, to not want to have, you know, ceaseless flights coming in from all over the world. One day, I mean, it was literally like one day, whoop, complete flip-flop of the positions on COVID, and it became, you know, a tool for the centralizers to start enforcing socialism on us and this and that. And, you know, people, obviously, all politicians, what they're doing is taking what's happening and trying to leverage it to their agenda. Yeah, there's, so COVID is one example, pandemic more generally. There's a very strong conservative case for pandemic mitigation via border control. I wish that conservatives, the right, whatever you want to call it, took that and ran with it, and they should have, and they still should. But it completely went out the window. Now it's all about masks, no masks, whatever. But guess what? It's not going to be the last pandemic, and you know, to the degree we're connected, it probably won't be the last pandemic in our lifetimes. And COVID's just the tip of the iceberg. So
yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to me that you say, you know, there's a conservative case to be made. I think the conservatives are kind of starting to wake up to the fact that, you know, economic libertarianism, like, you know, Koch brothers flavored libertarianism in the markets, is probably not the thing that's going to maintain, you know, the whatever nuclear family or whatever remnants of conservative ideals that they had. So I think there's a big contingent of them flipping the script and becoming, I don't know if protectionist is like a heavy word. It's like capitalism. It's, you know, it's something that's, you know, invented by its enemies. But the idea that you kind of have to think about local benefit before the abstract interests of, you know, the corporation or the business sector or something like that. So I wanted to ask you about libertarianism, because you have a very nuanced view of libertarianism. You're not a libertarian, which I think is a good idea. But, you know, why are you not a libertarian?
Well, for one thing, I'm not a libertarian because I pretty much refuse to identify with any label like that, because it just gets co-opted, captured, morphs over time, etc.
Yeah.
The closest I could become to being captured by a label is localist, but even there, I see that starting to, I don't want to say get away from me, because that sounds like I'm trying to control it, and I'm not, but it changes depending on who's using it, it morphs, and I just think labels have this problem where the fight becomes about the labels instead of whatever we're trying to do. So why am I not a libertarian? That's one reason. Some of the things we talk about, sort of this vision as the atomistic individual, and the idea that that's sufficient to structure a society at that scale, and with that as the primary interest. You know, I am a libertarian in many ways. I should say that. And for instance, I think that the way that you get multi-scaled structures, family, community, etc., is actually leaving people alone. Stop interfering with everything. Stop trying to guide them, nudge them, top down them, etc. So in that sense, I'm very much a libertarian, but the freedom should be to choose one's structure they bind into, which is something that's very non-individualistic. Being part of something, in fact, implies constraining the part, where the part is the individual in this case. And then, so there's sort of this abstract libertarianism, and then there's libertarians. And I think we're seeing a really interesting thing right now with this sort of libertarian party versus the Mises caucus that's emerging. And it's an interesting kind of push and pull happening here. And, for instance, one of the consequences of the sort of libertarian party end of this is that if you're imagining that everything should be handled by market forces, and that should all be the individual scale, that private entities are an inherent good because they're operating over these market structures, et cetera, you end up with absurd policy positions like open borders positions that are frankly just nonsense. Because if we look at how complex systems are able to persist in the real world, what the kinds of things that evolution produces, guess what? One of the basic pattern structures that is necessary are boundaries and borders, from cells to organisms to families and societies, nations, etc. So boundaries and borders are part of the logic of how complexity can actually manage itself and persist into something that is healthy and long-lived. So I guess there's a lot of reasons I'm not a libertarian, but I'm also I'm libertarian leaning, and mostly that's an anti-top-down intervention imposition type of leaning that I have, and that is in part so that communities can form. Mm-hmm. And yeah, right. With sort of the everything is Walmart, everything is the market. Is really antithetical to that local community, the emergence of and self-organization of that kind of a structure. So
no, I probably echo that position in a way. I'm also not pro government at like a large scale. The idea. I mean, I'm from Eastern Europe. My family grew up under communism. I was born under communism. Yeah, it doesn't feel that, it's not that hot, guys. But
well, yeah, again, actually, what you get when you scale these private enterprises up too much, you get pseudo governmental type of institutions, and you maybe have seen that sort of the don't tread on me snake with like the Coca-Cola and Walmart and whoever else kind of stomping on it, like, oh, at least it's not the government, So you kind of brought up in the beginning, I'm very scale sensitive, and when you scale these entities, they become something different. It's absurd to say that like mom and pop's pizzeria down the street is a private enterprise, so they're directly comparable to the Walmarts of the world, to the Monsantos of the world. They're not the same kind of thing. They're completely different animals, and a lot of libertarians are very blind to that. As long as it's not labeled the state, they're kind of like, okay, yeah, sure, do what you want. I mean, you're a private entity, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting how once a corporation reaches a certain level of scale, it becomes almost necessarily a public-private partnership between it and the state. It starts lobbying, favors, freezing out competition, making sure the mom and pop store is not long for this world, and at one point it's very hard to disentangle who's who in certain circles, like Washington DC, like who's the lobbyist and who's the politician. They all kind of are eating from the same trough.
That's exactly right, Alex. And I mean, that's, so when I have this discussion with self-professed libertarians, they tend to say, well, the reason that large corporations are able to do this is because of the state. If you just took care of the state, then the problem would take care of itself. And they're not seeing what you're seeing, which is actually, these are completely entangled. It's an irreducible complex. And if you had very large corporations that you refuse to address, and you have the state on the other hand, and you're only addressing the state, well, guess what? Every time you try to shrink it, the corporates will blow it back up again. So it's not going to deflate on its own. You have to kind of deflate them together. it is a complex.
Yeah. That's another question I wanted to ask you. When you have uh, institutions at scale, be they state or even private institutions. Is there a chance once they reach a certain tipping point, and maybe today 2021 looking at these institutions, is there a chance to deflate them in the sense of kind of recapturing the institutions, streamlining them, decomplexifying them, or is the better chance to create parallel institutions? So kind of like voice versus exit type of question. Is there a better should people just kind of mind their own business and kind of circumvent the big boys?
I mean, I guess I don't see those as distinctly different. If you do start to develop parallel types of systems, de facto you're going to be deflating them. I mean, they depend on your participation, and one of the things in the U.S. at least, I can't really speak for the rest of the world, but in the U.S. we still do have enough liberty that if everyone, or you don't even need everyone, if a decent percentage of people said, you know what, all of my purchases I've been making at the big supermarket chain, I'm going to look for farmers around me who I can buy directly from, and I'm going to start doing that, for example. That would have a huge impact, and that's sort of both at once. You're deflating the giants, and you're building up your more local systems, so it's got to be both. It's got to be both. So I know more about the U.S. than elsewhere, so sorry about that. I'll have to speak to that more directly. We have mechanisms for pulling back power. We can't wait, for instance, for the federal government to say, you know what, we actually want to cede this power back to you. You've made a wonderful argument. I understand now where you're coming from. Here you go. So, and this is already starting to happen. We have things like nullification. And for instance, in New Hampshire, a proposed law continues to move forward. Just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the day before, moved through a committee, which means it's going to be voted on soon. For any executive orders that are coming out of the Fed around gun control, et cetera, anything that even touches the Second Amendment in any kind of way, nullified in New Hampshire. We will not, not only will we not enforce that, but there's a law against enforcing it. Hopefully that passes. That's the right thing to do. These decisions should not be made so centrally. Other things like that, where so there's the anti-commandeering doctrine, which basically says the federal government has no power to coerce state agents to enforce things. So that's slightly softer than the nullification. But these kinds of tools are available and more increasingly used. And so that's what we should be focusing on. In fact, and I've done this elsewhere, and I will say a kind word about the Free State Project, which exists in New Hampshire, which is a libertarian project. But they've realized, trying to affect anything liberty-minded at the federal level is a non-starter. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your money, et cetera. But what you can do is pile a bunch of like-minded people into a state and start affecting the state government. And that has a lot of impact. And in New Hampshire, it's had a lot of impact. And we're starting to see the fruits of that now. And so I anticipate the next sort of era of the U.S. to be a reassertion of state authority. And you actually see it both from the left and the right. And it happened, for instance, quite a bit through COVID stuff too, where different states were trying different things. Some had technically, I don't know how much they were enforced, like quarantines on border crossings and things of that nature. So this is where I expect the near-term future of USA to go is okay, we've had this era where basically all the states were kind of playing nice with the Fed and kind of letting it dictate things. That's over, at least for now. So that's one way that we can kind of pull things back down again. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot one can do by simply not participating in the things that perpetuate these giants, and they're hungry. Giants are hungry. So if you stop feeding them, they suffer, and they will retaliate. Make no mistake about that. But it's necessary.
Yeah, it's quite a good kind of legal kind of substrate that you have in the U.S. Unfortunately, here in Romania, things are a bit more centralized, even at the local level, and then they're even more centralized because we're part of the European Union, and then even more so because we're like a peripheral member of the European Union, and we barely got in, and we're still sucking up to them in many ways. So it's probably not a very not the best of deals that we got here, but
It's amazing how these little nuances of constitutions and whatnot end up mattering in kind of more less tumultuous times. It looks like just sort of a difference of a few words, who's no big deal. But in these times with more tension, these things start to become tools for one or the other, either the centralizers, the decentralizers. And like, for instance, you look at Canada, and they don't really have a Bill of Rights like we do in the US. They have some kind of a rights charter. I don't know exactly what it's called, but there's one of my Canadian friends showed me exactly what the problem is. It's that right in the preamble of this Charter of Rights, there's language that basically says, these are the rights we're going to try to give you if we can, if we're, if it's not too inconvenient. Obviously I'm paraphrasing, but that's the basic language. Is like, and it's like, wow, that matters a lot. These become the things that, at a level beneath, all out warfare. These things are important tools for wrangling power structures and whatnot.
yeah, and I think there's also a big difference between kind of Anglo style common law, where essentially you kind of have the negative space between you and the law, and you have this very positivist French style that we've adopted wholesale, and it's all about, if it's not allowed, you need it to be explicitly allowed in the law, and it's quite a constraining, just the frame of mind to instantiate law in that way. You can see that it reflects the freedom loving Anglo people versus the I don't know, law and order obsessed.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And there's all the difference in the world between sort of these positive statements and these negative statements. That's obviously one of the things that those who are more French minded in the U.S. are pushing, are all of these different rights at the federal level. Healthcare is a right, housing is a right, and it's exactly the real danger. There isn't any of those particular ideas. Say it's the shifting from negative rights to positive ones, which are completely of a different character, and they start compelling people to do particular things as opposed to compelling people to not infringe on others. So yeah, absolutely. And common law is quite a powerful thing, as is tort law, and these bottom up types of legal structures are extremely powerful. And I think these are the kinds of things that people in millennials, essentially, we need to start wrapping our minds around these and working with them, using what's given, and working with it so that we can get out of the kind of trajectory we're on, which is, what's not clear to those who seek the central structures is that it's not going to be good for them either. People think, oh, I'm going to be on the right side of this, I'm going to be on the top, and sorry, you're not. Very few will be, and it's going to be miserable for everyone. So
Yeah. I think you, in some tweets or in some place, you mentioned distributism as kind of an interesting, in a way, a compromise between full-blown libertarian, anarcho-capitalism and, controlled, centrally controlled planned economy. I've been looking into this myself, and I think it sounds great. Obviously, I don't think it's been tried anywhere except for maybe very religious communities at a very small scale. But yeah, I'm curious, if you could explain what it is, and then why it might be an interesting proposition.
I'm not. I don't think I'm a scholar on distributism enough to authoritatively say what it is, but I will say how it's impacted my thinking, and what I think is worth folding it into the discussion. Why it's worth folding in. So it's kind of a descendant of Catholic social teaching. It was G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc who started developing this notion of distributism as its own kind of political idea. And what's so fascinating, if you read them, is that where you begin is a critique of capitalism. And it's almost like you could be reading Marx. and it's focused on the fact that there's a tendency to concentration, and this concentration has all kinds of side effects and consequences that are detrimental to many folks' position in the world. The interesting twist is that where they end up is the polar opposite of Marxism. They say what we need is a lot of private ownership, a lot of small scale private ownership. Sort of the centerpiece of distributism is the smallholder, the family with some land who produces something, has a trade, and kind of operates at that trade. Or even, the shop too has its place, right? It's not that you only need a primary producer and that should always be directed. The shop has its place, but everything's small. So private but small. So they're both hitting on this distinction between this public and private, and saying things needs to be a lot of private things in the world, but they're not getting carried away like some libertarians do in this label of private as solving all these problems by itself. Actually, when private things get too big, they become pathological as well, and especially where we prop them up. I'm getting like annoying sounds popping up, so we'll quit that. So that's where they come from, and that's in essence how their critique is really, I think, valuable in this space, because it's what Marx got right is that things in a capitalist system, in many different kinds of systems, but in a capitalist system as well, things can concentrate to a degree where they become pathological, where people become alienated, where we have this kind of atomized individual in a way that's detrimental to our well-being and the flourishing of humanness. They see that too, and the answer for them is bring it small, bring it local. G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite quips from him is, keep the politicians close enough to kick them. Complete skin in the game type of argument. Like, this is, you can't just let people who are essentially disconnected from the system dictate how the thing operates. It will never end up in something good, no matter how good the intentions are. And this is one of the things that flows out of looking at the world through kind of a system science lens, is that pretty much all of the consequences of actions are unintended. Many, many, many more orders of magnitude more of the consequences of things are things that no one intended or are antithetical to what was intended. So you kind of people's intentions stop mattering so much. It's like, yeah, okay, I hear you want to help, but you're really hurting, so who cares that you want to help or you thought you were helping. So one of the places I will say I've been left wanting with distributism as such is, what do you do about it? What are the actions you take? And their major solution is progressive taxation of large things. And I think that's fraught with a lot of problems, because never mind the ethical questions of is taxing big things fair or whatever. There's actually just functional issues like, well, who collects that tax money? What do they do with it? Who sets those taxes? So you kind of have this implicit need for a central authority who's managing these taxation regulations and the flows of the money they bring in. And that breeds its own set of problems. So I've been a little bit, I don't want to say disappointed, but I don't think that they've quite hit on everything that would be necessary to actually affect a distributist type of structure. Not to say that I'm exactly clear on how we would bring that about in full either, but recognize there's some work to do there.
Yeah, I think it's hard to put a cap on capital. Like you said, Marx identified the tendency for it to concentrate, to centralize, and yeah, it's a tough thing to say, oh, okay, you're not really having economies of scale, you're not really having network externalities, which is kind of the big thing now in tech. It's pretty hard to put a cap on things like that, because you can really have a smallholder owning Twitter, or things like that require a lot of scale in themselves, are tricky to do at that scale. So I can see, I think this is probably could be part of the solution for local communities in some way, if you want to be part of an opt-in community. then having kind of a distributist lens on how the local government works, I think that'd be super useful. But yeah.
And just generally, the fact that the solution to alienation via capital accrual is not large scale socialism or communism. That's actually just exacerbating the problem. So that's the insight that I hope that some people who maybe have gotten swept up in the critique of capital and see that as the only way. Well, then therefore, what we need is everything to be public in the large scale. But that's got its own problems, obviously. And there's another, just the insight that smallness is another way, not switch large private things to large public things, but actually break things into smaller pieces and let them organize at that scale.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. I feel like the diagnosis is a bit off. People are not deprived of money. They're not. I mean, I think in Marxist time there was a lot of child labor. The industrialization was pretty intense. People were actually deprived, and in terms of material goods. At the moment, you have obesity crises and a lot of alienation and all sorts of problems with mental health, but sending someone an extra check, obviously a lot of people would benefit from it for sure, but at the same time I don't think it's going to change something civilizationally, be it UBI or be it another form of welfare. There's a different type of malaise at the center of this, and I think it has to do with scale, and I think it has to do with a sad effect of comfort in a way. It's in a way a lot of this alienation is what's that called, a revealed preference. People kind of want to be alone. They want to have independence from structures like family, and they want to be the self-making self, but at the same time it has a negative toll on people. So I'm curious what you think. How much of this is in a way self-made? It's just a result of the fact that we can now afford not to be in huge families helping each other out, and you don't have to put up with the baker, you don't have to put up with your alcoholic uncle, and in a way that's really terrible because it has effects on your being alone and being atomized. But in a way it's also like, yeah, of course, if I can choose not to see old Bill today, I probably will.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there is a large degree of it that is a process of self-selection and with short-sighted type of aims. And it's a hard question, because there is a bit of, well, you have to choose it to go the other direction. You have to choose your own shackles, so to speak. You're never going to be free in some kind of an absolute sense. So like we're talking about arbitrariness with construction. There's also a sense of freedom as arbitrariness, which is similar, but coming from a different angle. And it has to start at sociocultural values and our ability to actually perceive things at longer time scales. I think we operate in very short time scales today. Doing things that are, when my experience, I can just speak to my experience here, is that bringing things more local, my dependencies more local, my activities more local, learning how hard it can be, but also how rewarding it can be to cultivate land, for instance. When your interfaces become local in that way, your perception of timescales changes such that you start to see the longer timescales and the effects they have. And so I think it's actually a literal perceptual thing, that it's not, we've lost it in large part, but it's something that humans can regain and can have, is a different kind of perception that operates over these generational timescales. And once that shift starts to take hold, then you get a better clarity into what's really giving you freedom and what's really constraining you and enslaving you. And the things that appear on the short term to free you up, okay, now I don't have to see, oh, that old drunker Bill, whatever it is, you find out that actually over a longer time scale, I'm constrained by all the things that I'm avoiding and all of the things I'm not obligated to do, and this and that. That actually sends you down a very narrow path. There's not much you can do if that's what you're doing. When you start to have these more obligate type relationships in a community, there's a larger scale freedom that's starting to develop, that's around autonomy of the way of life, and the way of life is not housed in an individual but in a collective. And I think that can be abstractly comprehended, but I think it can also be concretely perceived. But it requires one to start to enter into that as a matter. How do I say it? It requires one to enter into that to begin for those types of perceptions to bubble up and cohere and become direct and not merely abstract.
Yeah, so you kind of have to understand it, because it's not something that comes naturally, because like you said, people's time scales are pretty constrained. You kind of have you have immediate needs. You want to solve your most expedient problem, and then I think this ties into kind of the concept of freedom that we now have. Freedom now means the individual can do whatever he or she wants. But kind of in Aristotelian times, freedom was in a way kind of cultivating yourself to be free from the constraints of the body in a way. Like, for example, you would kind of mind over matter, kind of have that kind of stoical freedom from the vagaries of life, where you kind of gain power, you win freedom for yourself to cultivate yourself. And it feels like that concept of freedom is kind of put to the side for the concept of freedom, where you can have 10,000 types of Chinese food tonight, and that's the ultimate freedom. But there's also something tied into this with optionality, because you hear a lot of these Silicon Valley types saying, okay, the best strategy for life is to maximize optionality. How many options is this opening up? How many? But at the same time, I mean, this feels like you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot after a while. I think you'd probably good to do this at one point. But if you cultivate infinite optionality and you keep doing that, in a way, the only option you have is infinite optionality. You haven't really committed to some things that might make your life better in the long term.
Well, that's right. I mean, I guess what that really says isn't that the notion that one should cultivate optionality is wrong, but that it's actually a subtle art to do that. And because what you do is you start closing off options, actually, as you in this attempt to maintain them potentially, and sort of optimize optionality. So if I want to, for instance, if one of the options I wish to experience in my life is to, let's say, enjoy an orchard that I planted with my grandchildren. Okay, that actually requires quite a commitment, and it does shave off other options potentially with that commitment. But if my freedom is in having that option as a possibility, something that could really be realized, then I need to do certain things, and I need to commit myself to it in certain ways. And so, indeed, if your notion of optionality is any number of a set of things at any moment I can kind of switch into, and I'm never committed to anything, then in essence you're actually reducing your options. And so it's you can almost think of it like an optimization problem, but the number of unknowns in terms of conditions of that optimization problem is too large to actually solve for it. So you have to use your intuition, and like I said, it's really an art. So I don't think it's wrong, but it's easy for it to be oversimplified in a way that is indeed a reduction of optionality. Yeah, and at the same time, it is important for society not to, or an individual, to overcommit to the degree that it would be disastrous if a certain pathway doesn't unfold as expected. So it's not obvious. I think the like you said, sort of Silicon Valley type of attitude approach is naive in the sense that you're describing. And as we think about options and where we end up, we need to understand that if your idea is like as many branch points in my immediate moment that I could take tomorrow, then yeah, you're actually reducing options in possibility space in over larger trajectories. So I think you're absolutely right.
There's I don't know if this is maybe I'm butchering this concept, but there's this idea of optimum grip, where for most kind of problems that you want, like for example, if you're picking up a piece of fruit that's ripe, you kind of want to have optimum grip. You don't want to keep it too loosely so that it falls out of your hand, and then you also don't want to squeeze the living life out of it. So you kind of have to have that perfect balance, and it feels like you want to be, for many problems like this, I feel like the human mind tends to have a bias for absolutes, where it's like, okay, what are you? What is the label? What is the thing? But for most solutions to most problems are kind of some form of optimum grip, where you don't want to, you kind of want to strike the balance. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complex idea, but yeah,
No, but I mean, this is really nonlinearity in general. I mean, what you're describing, if you imagine it almost like as a graph, is like an inverted U. And there's sort of, if you get too loose, okay, that's not good. Too tight, that's not good. Most things in life are this way. There's some kind of a sweet spot. And now that invites the mind to then say, okay, there's an optimization here. The problem is that we can't do the calculations. There's not some set of computations that's going to help you discover what that optimum truly is. For something like grabbing an apple, it's pretty obvious for us. But for more subtle things, life trajectories and things of that nature, there is some nonlinearity like that where there's a balance that needs to be struck. But where that is actually is impossible to say, and so you have to kind of tinker around and feel around, and I really think it is an art. It's not a science.
yeah.
And yeah,
I also wanted to ask you, being a student of complexity, and as far as I remember, you were saying that this was kind of something that was common in your household as well. I mean, your father was taught complexity. He understood complexity. What was kind of the most important thing that you've integrated into your life, your personal life, just the art of living by understanding complexity?
great question. It is that the most important things in life can't be controlled, and that what you can do is nurture them and set up the conditions that they can grow and evolve in healthy ways. And the moment you try to talk about optimal grip, the moment you try to grip it, you destroy it. So those are the things that, and I think a lot of people learn this lesson in multiple domains the hard way. But whatever you're trying most to hang on to seems to be the thing that is most elusive, and it's not some magic trick or something. It's that in the gripping you're destroying it. And so everything of importance is done indirectly.
Mm. Yeah, that's hard for the rational mind to.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And so my father, you mentioned my father, he engineer by training, but not an engineer in so most engineers have this issue where they think in terms of control and construction and what is the thing I need to build. And and that works for simple things, but as soon as you hit some threshold of complexity, it's not only insufficient, it's exactly antithetical to what needs to be done. And obviously you see this in politics. It's like, oh, we have problems, so therefore we need to draw out the appropriate narrative, and then via that narrative kind of put things into the right place because they're in the wrong place now. And that's kind of the engineering mindset. And it's just not how complexity flourishes.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. There's so many concepts kind of in the space that you're floating in, and you're also a representative of, is it Lindy Twitter, or the.
I'm 100% not a representative of Lindy Twitter. I have actually find that the discussion around Lindy has become clownish and absurd.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for triggering you, but yeah, it's an interesting space. I don't think I am part of Lindy Twitter. I'm a fellow traveler with some people, but not with some.
Right, right. No, no. I guess I'm Lindy Twitter adjacent. The problem is, I think this Lindy idea is a really important concept that comes from Nassim, um, um, but it's been made into a cartoon by that fellow.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I like him. I actually he keeps like blocking and unblocking me for some reason. I've never interacted with him, but yeah, whenever I check, there's some status change there.
That's
Um, but it's an interesting concept. Like I feel like there's quite a lot of overlap with the kind of post-rationalist, into trad space with Lindy. Obviously, there's Lindy's kind of a more secular concept. Trad's a bit more like, I don't know, has a bit more roots, and it's got all sorts of weird offshoots. But I feel like there's just quite a lot of overlap. I'm curious, what do you think? What makes something Lindy? What's the time scale? How would one know that it's Lindy just by observation across time?
I mean, okay. To get into the Lindy stuff specifically, if you take Nassim's framing of it, essentially a heuristic by which you're making a guess about how long something will live based on how long it's lived. It's a statistical idea, and it actually doesn't say anything about, if something new emerges, will this thing last? You just kind of can't say. Um, so there's that aspect. There's also the aspect that different kinds of things, um, um, by their nature, are either Lindy type of things or not. For instance, a human individual is not Lindy. Why? Because the older you get, the more likely you are to die.
Hmm.
A culture, something like that, could be Lindy. It's a pattern. So things that are sort of about a pattern that can be reconstituted, sort of copied and replicated, those things have the potential to be Lindy types of things. Things that are individual instances of things that can break and die in and of themselves, those are not Lindy things. So it's sort of classes versus instances in a sense. I'll kind of inject a different way of thinking about these things that I find useful. And this comes from Chris Alexander. And Chris Alexander is an architect, but also a systems scholar. And one of his seminal works is called The Timeless Way of Building. And in that, he really makes it clear that there is an important distinction between something that's old and something that's timeless. Timeless things come into existence all the time. They don't need to be old. You could build a little cottage in a timeless manner today, and that wouldn't mean that it's new, but it's timeless. Something can be old and not timeless as well. So I actually prefer thinking in terms of this, like what kinds of patterns, or even more than what kinds of patterns, what kind of processes that generate things in the world. What kind of processes are timeless and what kind of processes are not? What kind are kind of bound in their specific historical moment or otherwise, not not harmonious or in concert with the way that the world has built itself from time immemorial. So I think oldness can be a kind of proxy to that. More old things are timeless because actually it's the way that things have always been done. And it's more recently that we've started to do things in a different kind of way. And so the newer something is, the less likely to be timeless for that reason. Um, but yeah, it has to do with, how is the thing generated? Is it generated in a way that's organic and unfolding with a sensitivity to the context and an ability to adapt to it at sort of multiple scales? Or is it something developed abstractly in a blueprint with a very specific idea without the context, sort of implying that there's a blank slate to be painted on and sort of constructed on? So I find that to be an extremely important distinction, because I think a lot of the critique of something like traditionalism comes from this idea of, well, what's the logic that just because it's old, it ought to be good or something like that? And to me, that's actually a somewhat valid critique, because that's true. Something that's old could be shit. Like, I don't want something just because it's old, but older things tend to have this timeless quality to them more often, and newer things that's more and more rare, unfortunately, to find that. Um,
Yeah.
and so and things evolve in general. Evolutionary processes are all over the place. It's not just sort of biological, genetic. It's cultural. It's practice based. It's all kinds of things. Evolution is a very generic kind of way for things to develop form and complexity over time. And so things that have been around a while typically are products of some kind of evolutionary process, and have functional properties to them that can be quite subtle, but contribute to their ability to persist. Um,
Yeah, there's that kind of leads me into my next question. I think it's tied into your beef with Jordan Peterson. I want to ask
I
you
think
about.
it's generous to say I have a beef with Jordan Peterson because it implies that he knows I exist, and I don't think that he necessarily does. But yeah, go on.
Oh, well, the beef, as far as I could tell, you had some harsh words to say about Jordan Peterson, and I mean, obviously, I don't know the whole context, but I feel like it has something to do with GMOs, and his support, or him being supported by some big GMO company or something like that. Don't know the whole context. Jordan Peterson, he's a I don't know. I think he's been a father figure to many, so I wouldn't dismiss him out of hand. But this is more a question about GMOs than Jordan Peterson, because I feel like GMOs are one instance of what you were describing before, about things being kind of engineered top down and just thrown into our pre-existing ecosystem, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, you kind of wrapped it up with GMOs right there. It's funny because proponents, shills, etc. will tell you, oh, everything's been genetically modified. There's no difference. Well, if that were the case, then why would we be? How could we discuss the new technologies? What the new technologies doing, if not something new? And in fact, they are. Of course, it's a kind of, oh, we'll design the system, we'll insert the properties into the organism that we believe will improve our business model, and without care for these externalities, these ecosystem type of externalities. If you take an ecosystem where everything is co-evolved, because evolution is always really co-evolution. Things are evolving together and actually learning to play nice with one another. That's one of the most important aspects of an ecosystem, is that the pieces actually are not just all out to be as sort of rapidly consumptive as possible. That actually that's a suicide kind of policy in an ecosystem, because you'll overexploit your resources. And so when you take something that doesn't have a coevolutionary history, it doesn't need to be GMO in that case. It could be like an invasive species. This is why we have quote unquote invasive species. It's because you're taking something out of its original context, putting it in a new context where there's no shared history, and that time hasn't elapsed for the play nice kind of dynamics to emerge. So GMO has that problem in a very acute way. New proteins are massively being amplified and synthesized in contexts they've never been before, that have clearly detrimental effects. I mean, that's what they're designed for, to things like insects. Well, guess what? Insects play very important roles in ecosystems. They pollinate things. They do all sorts of things. Everything in a given ecosystem has a functional role it plays with other things, and we don't understand all of them, but they're there, and we depend on them. So GMOs it's this kind of top-down vision of constructing systems, but putting them in the context necessarily of living ecosystems, and kind of seeing what happens. And in fact, they just released again GMO insects in the Keys in Florida, mosquitoes, and it's like these are the kinds of fat-tailed risks that what's not understood about fat-tailed risks is the fact that, yeah, most of the time it'll be fine. It's not like, oh, we guarantee this is going to destroy the ecosystem. It's like, no, most of the time you'll roll the dice, you'll be all right. Every once in a while, you'll be so fucking wrong that you won't even get to regret it. You won't have the opportunity to regret it. You're going to fuck it up so bad. So that's a very important point about the kinds of systemic risks that GMOs have, is that, yeah, most of the time you'll be all right. That's not you can't use that logic though, because when you're wrong, you're going to be very, very wrong. So that's one thing. You know, I guess I should, you brought up in the frame of Jordan Peterson, so I should say like a bit about how he's wrapped up in that. And in fact, what I saw from him, what part of the reason I was upset about the GMO stuff with him is because I was kind of interested in him, and I was like, okay, we need some other kinds of voices in this space, and he's bring a different angle to it, and some of the things he's saying I resonate with strongly and agree with. I also saw that he, to me, now this is completely my judgment and my perspective, but I saw what seemed to me to be a little too much enjoyment of the limelight, a little too much um, hunger for fame. In fact, I think he as he started to sort of rise in popularity, maybe legitimately so, with organic interest, signed on to like a Hollywood agency. It's kind of antithetical to kind of stuff he preaches about. Started doing these worldwide tours. It was all about talking, and it's kind of a performance art. It becomes a performance art. So I started to see that. Then, while I'm in the sort of throes of these arguments around GMO and whatnot, all of a sudden he pops up at Monsanto's yearly ag conference as the special guest speaker, promoted, you know, by all their typical PR kind of shill department, and say, what the fuck is Jordan Peterson doing here? And then, so he's talking at that thing. They're saying, oh, you know, and what are they doing? They're marketing. They're using Jordan Peterson to market Monsanto. That's what their interest is in this, right? They're not interested in the things Jordan Peterson has to say. It's a marketing thing. That's why they're doing it. So he's being used as a marketing thing. Of course, he's being paid for it. That's just how that stuff works. Okay, that's one level. I find that very distasteful. I looked at the talk. He talked about his ideas. He didn't talk about ag, which is reasonable. He doesn't know anything about ag. Simultaneously, though, he starts tweeting exactly word for word all of the propaganda bullshit that Monsanto puts out. Oh, if you're against GMOs, you're pro starving children. Okay, whoa. these are like shill lines that are, in my opinion, very unethical. Like, no, that's not it at all. Actually, I'm trying to protect starving children, all people. Like, these are issues that we need to take really seriously. And there was no substance to it. So it was pretty weird of him to show up at this Monsanto conference, simultaneously start tweeting out these kind of PR lines. And to me, it's very different than what he's supposedly promoting, which is kind of personal responsibility and this and that, or whatever. It just doesn't sit well with me. I never could turn my view around on him after that. After all that, he had this kind of, very public kind of breakdown of his health and well-being due to addiction problems. I'm not belittling addiction problems. People have issues, and they should be taken seriously, treated as health issues, I believe. But again, to me, it looks a bit antithetical to what he's preaching, which is like, how do you bring order into your life? From my perspective, his life is chaotic. He's the last person in the world I would listen to about how to bring order into my life. The last person. So those are some of my problems with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I wasn't aware of any of the GMO thing. I think you mentioned it just in passing.
They're still up there.
Yeah, I'll have a look at that. That's very strange, but it's all this GMO stuff. Like, I remember, like, my original community on the internet was kind of this new atheist, atheism plus type stuff. And GMOs were such a big talking point in those communities, and it was all about the golden rice, and it was all about how people who didn't like the science were all stupid. Obviously everyone in new atheism fucking loved science, and we were all just the pre Reddit people, and we were making the memes of the golden rice. And if I remember correctly, I have no idea how I was incepted with this idea that GMOs is the best of science, and anyone who speaks against them is dumb. But it was all over the place. It was one of the most common concepts in there.
Well, they literally, 2014, I co-authored a paper with Nassim Taleb, Yanir Baryam, a couple other gentlemen, and we critiqued from a systemic risk perspective GMO agriculture and wild release GMO generally, not just agriculture, but any kind of wild release GMO. And that was extremely eye-opening for me in sort of my trajectory of understanding how the world operates. Because what happened was the PR swarms started showing up. And these are accounts on, for instance, Twitter and other social media that are just people who are literally paid to go promote certain ideas on the behalf of certain corporations. And they are PR firms. So, for instance, Monsanto at the time had hired this firm called Ketchum PR, and it was all these Ketchum trolls and shills that would just show up endlessly in your thing and whatever. They were just, they weren't there to debate the merits of the technology, the science. They're there to amplify a specific agenda for a corporation. And they really have no idea about any of the science, and they certainly don't understand anything about complex systems and systemic risk. And they had nothing useful to say about it. And so, you know, sometimes it's called astroturfing, right? Because it's meant to look like grassroots. These people are meant to look like they're, oh, I care so much of the sun. Well, it turns out that, like, in communities like that, they were sophisticated enough to target these sort of rationalistic communities and see these ideas. Why? Because if you're really into rationalism, then that all seems to make sense. Like, we know how the parts work. We can put it together better than it's ever been put together before, because now we understand, right? Well, that's I don't really know what post-rationalism is, but maybe it's what I'm about to say. When you take rationalism to the limit, one of its virtues actually is that it can deconstruct and defeat itself. And this is exactly what like Kurt Gödel did, for instance, and others did, Turing did, and some others, Wittgenstein. You can actually show that this sort of rational mindset has very hard limits that reality does not obey. Reality operates beyond those limits. And so things like GMO, actually, it's not that we will tell you what is exactly going to go wrong. It's that there's no way you can rule those things out in a systemic, in like a comprehensive way. So yeah, I mean, there is a virtue there that if you take it to the limit, it can find its own boundaries. But most of the time, people are operating well below that boundary. They become seduced by the idea that this kind of covers everything. And in fact, it's not only that we can sort of intuit that it doesn't, it technically doesn't in a very precise way. So yeah, it's an interesting GMO is a very interesting kind of touch point for all these ideas because of the way it seems scientific. It's a technology, etc., but it actually gets right at the limits of what we can actually say about how the world operates and predict what's going to happen, which pretty much our powers of prediction in the midst of complexity are non-existent.
Yeah, I remember kind of the argument was mostly around, because of the agricultural revolution, Norman Borlaug, he saved 1 billion children, and then we were like, the framing was that you were kind of killing 1 billion children if you weren't for the next step in the ag revolution, which is GMOs. So it was a bit of a bit of like an eschatological, this is the new millennium, we were entering the age of science, saving all the children. Not very rationalistic if I look back at it.
You've got a word for that, pedophrasty, where you unethically raise children into the conversation to try to emotionally win the argument there. So yeah, it's a dirty move. Anytime I see it, I just block. Done.
That's good. You're a good blocker. I think your policy for blocking is quite healthy, and I strive towards it.
It certainly makes my experience a lot more enjoyable. That's for sure.
That's the thing. You reduce complexity. Who needs too much?
It's noise otherwise. That's the thing. Complexity is not just about a lot of stuff and a lot of complication. It's about sort of appropriate degrees of order and disorder and how those interrelate to each other. So that's another, you were talking about sort of balance points before. It's order and disorder. These are things that are always existing in balance as well in living systems.
Yeah, that's one thing I'll take with me, and I'll try to put it into my blocking policy. I feel like I'm still a bit too liberal, or not liberal enough. Before I let you go, I want to ask you the question of the show, which is do you have a thinker, could be a writer, could be a scientist or not, that was influential to you, but maybe someone subversive that you think deserves a bit more limelight, a bit more attention from people, that people should read or look up?
My 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 go-to here is a fellow I've already mentioned, Chris Alexander. Um, Everyone should. He's an architect, but also speaks to life, and so I always recommend him. But although I will say, I've seen in the last year or so, he's blown up on Twitter quite a bit. That meme has gotten out there, and there are a lot of people reading him and stuff. So maybe he's a little too known for this. Um, One of my favorite thinkers, I'm actually reading one of his sort of major life works for like the third or fourth time right now, called Life Itself, is a fellow named Robert Rosen. And he's a theoretical biologist, and his arguments are absolutely in the realm of science, and so maybe don't speak so directly to social issues and stuff like that, but in the realm of science, his arguments are absolutely subversive. Some of the things we take most for granted about how we frame and model systems, he takes those to task, and essentially shows how we have so many of our assumptions inverted about what's general, what's special, what systems are, the difference between how we characterize a system and what a system is in its essence. There's technical things here, so I don't know how worth it is to mention, but like, for instance, we tend to think of and this permeates all of science, physics, everything. Systems we associate with states, the state the system is in, and the states it moves through, and then the laws, the natural law that move the system from one state to another. That's sort of the foundational framing of physical science. That's what he takes to task, which is a fascinating thing, to question what seems to be unquestionable. And he does it in a remarkable way. He leverages category theory to do it. It's not an easy read, or any of his work is, but it's absolutely profound. It's on the nature of causality, really, in its essence. Aristotle had four categories of causality. Three kind of cohere to what we typically think of as scientific reasoning, sort of the past by necessity leads to the future via the lawful progression of things. Aristotle had a fourth cause, final causality, that's associated with the idea that the why of something, why it happens, is often attributed to what that causes. So, for instance, if I'm going to say, well, what caused you to pick the apple from the tree? I could have a story about your nervous system, your pattern recognition, all these kind of past to future types of causality. But another seemingly reasonable answer, is that, well, I picked an apple because I wanted to eat an apple, but I eat the apple after I picked the apple. So if the cause of picking the apple is eating the apple, then was the future causing the past? Well, that doesn't jive with physics. So how do you reconcile that? So his life's work is really around how first of all, let's take that kind of causality seriously. Let's not say it's just an illusion or something. Let's admit that it's a kind of emergent property of the kinds of living systems that we are, and then let's take that seriously, and let's see what we can do with it. So very subversive in that way. Not sure it's the kind of subversive you're looking for, but.
No, that sounds super fascinating. I mean, obviously, it sounds also like it could be quite technically serious to take on. But I like the idea of analyzing causality and maybe questioning like the rationalistic frame. That's kind of been my main interest in the last few years. I'm now probably what would be called a post-rationalist, whatever that is. I mean, yeah, like you said, it's just another label, but yeah, I've felt the edges of it, and now I'm looking around to see what could be interesting around that.
Well, if post-rationalism means out-rationalizing the rationalizers, then I'm all for it. That's what I like to do.
Yeah. Well, perfect. We'll make a club. Thank you so much. This was super interesting. I'm really glad we got to do this. Is there a place you want to direct people to? Something they should buy, subscribe to, interact with?
Just Twitter. Normonics on Twitter. Normonics. Easiest place to get in touch with me. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
if I want, so I'll shill one thing. I run a course. I've been doing it for about a year now. It's like a full semester style course I do synchronously. I've had a lot of success with that so far. But if people if any of these ideas are really engaging to anybody and they want to know where to dig in more, I would say, to have a look at that and see if that's of interest to you.
Excellent. And also, yeah, just follow Joe on Twitter. It's a very worthwhile follow. Also follow his wife, Chelsea Norman.
Yeah,
She's great. So yeah, and also yeah, thank you to you and thank you to Chelsea as well. She's given me so much great advice with this whole physical process that I'm undergoing right now.
she's the real wisdom in the household. I get to pontificate while she actually handles the real shit. So
Yeah,
nice.
well, as it should be, as it should be. Cheers. Thank you so much for coming on, Joe.
Thanks, Alex. Really nice to be here. Thank you.